Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Chelsea. Really, really appreciate our time already together today, and I appreciate everyone for joining. As Chelsea just mentioned, my name is Brian O'Connor. I am with Futures Without Violence, and I'll be sharing a bit more about Futures and the organization in a little bit, but a little bit about me, because I want to hear also more about you coming as we continue our conversation together, is that I've been with Futures for about 15 years. My role here is I head the public education campaigns and programs team, in which Changing Minds Now and the initiative overall around addressing childhood trauma is some of the work that I do. And so my background, even before I worked with Futures, I was in advertising, and I was a journalist in New York. And so really looking at how the importance of story can really help us advance both our local community narratives as well as advancing national dialogue in a whole host of areas. And particularly, as many of you have probably noticed or seen, or was really an impetus for signing up to registering for this webinar today, was really about how the visibility of childhood trauma and what it is, and particularly the effects on young people and how we can better address it, has gotten a lot more in the headlines most recently, and has gotten a lot more attention, certainly. And so I think that with thinking about social emotional learning responses and more around trauma-informed teaching and trauma-informed practices within schools and approaches is one where we also want to be focusing in, and I'm curious about your experience with some of that. So before then as well, I'd like to thank, as I mentioned, thank you. I'd like to thank the AFT overall, certainly Chelsea Prax, Susan Ward, Laura Brown, and Amy Turner Delagula, who have been a tremendous support to me and Futures in this work, and most specifically setting up this session with you. I also want to give a shout out to several of my colleagues who are on the phone, Amanda Sorrell, Casey Corcoran, and Erin Fairchild, who have been instrumental in this work we do to help address childhood trauma and promote solutions to this problem. So this is one that we know will grow and change and show up in different ways due to this current crisis. And so at our end of our time together, I'd also love to hear some of your reflections in the chat box on what you may already be seeing and experiencing in your community, and how you're looking to respond and serve not only your own personal family and loved ones, but also certainly the role that you play is so critical in the community around kind of engaging with parents and caregivers and the students themselves. As you might have noticed in the title of today's conversation, but also the initiative overall, Changing Minds, there is a double meaning here. So that drives the approach to this campaign program. And I use the words campaign and program somewhat synonymously here, as you'll see that Changing Minds overall includes a number of campaign and public awareness building type materials, along with more program-based approaches and tools that can be used in and out of school settings. So the double meaning is around, one, how are we able to change minds, shift perspective on the importance of how we better respond and support kids who experience traumatic events in their lives. And particularly here, we're focusing on today experiencing traumatic events related to living with or witnessing violence at home, at school, and in the community. And then the other meaning, if you will, when it comes to Changing Minds is really getting into what are the physiological effects on the developing brain, particularly on a child's developing brain, when they witness or experience violence and abuse. And so I want to call that piece out there. As I mentioned, I'll be sharing a bit about Futures Without Violence. Our name is our vision. And so that vision is broad and ambitious, and it's to create safer homes and communities so that all individuals can thrive. We advocate for policy, programs, and public education that focuses on ending and preventing violence and abuse for women and children. And so we were founded 40 years ago and have partnered with countless organizations, both in the U.S. and around the world, on the work that we do. And our main office is in San Francisco, and where I'm based, along with our offices in D.C. and Boston. And so I'm looking in the group chat box and seeing that folks are coming from all over, and so thank you so much for that information, particularly as I'd love to know a little bit about yourself as we continue on in this conversation today. So the first poll question up is, I want to know, is in the past 2 years, have any of you received any training tools associated with childhood trauma? Sorry, have you received any training or tools? So it could be some professional development elements within your school or your district, any particular materials or resources that have been developed by, certainly by Chelsea and her team at the AFT. The National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network also has a whole host of very useful materials for educators. So please, in the poll that's on the screen now, let us know yes or no if in the past 2 years you've received any training or tools associated with childhood trauma. Please. I see some, quite a few of you have certainly had training or experience with, again, childhood trauma. It has a number of terms that have been associated with it. Toxic stress certainly is a term we've heard in the national dialogue around these issues and how we address it. Childhood PTSD is also another term that has been used to describe what are the effects of young people experiencing or going through traumatic events in their life. All right, so I'm going to go to the next slide here. And 71%. And I also saw there that, even for many who have received training and are familiar with some tools, that there's more we can do. I saw several folks say they want more. Some folks are doing ACEs training. ACEs is also something to know, where ACEs stands for the Adverse Childhood Experience Survey or Study. And so certainly look that up too, as if you're interested in learning more about childhood trauma and what that study reveals is really important. So I've shared with you a bit about me and Futures, and as I mentioned, I'd love to know more about who's joined us today. So in addition to the information that we'll have from your registration, can you please know that we'll also have some follow-up questions that'll particularly be about your role in the school where you work, how long you've been an educator, the type of school you work in, and it'll be in the follow-up survey to the webinar. So please, please, please respond, because that'll be very informative around how we look to take this conversation and help optimize some of the materials and tools that are created under the banner of Changing Minds. So we're crafting this webinar more as an online focus group, if you will. So after further introducing Changing Minds, we're going to share a couple of new resources that are recently developed. And so in particular, we're going to solicit your feedback through a series of poll questions about a new infographic for school staff that we created in partnership with AFT. So some of you actually may be familiar with it already, because we started distributing it last year and continue to optimize that material. And so having background information on who is on with us today and helping us improve these pieces will be essential and much appreciated. So as I've framed up our time together as a focus group, the brief agenda is that we're going to first go through and discuss a discussion around what is childhood trauma and how might it be showing up in your school, and then moving into the brain science of trauma, particularly on the impact on a child's developing brain when witnessing or experiencing repeated violence and abuse. And finally, we'll get into the Changing Minds Now campaign and program objectives, audience, and elements for your use. Earlier, I mentioned that my colleagues are on the phone, though I'll be doing all the talking. Lucky you. So no, I'm joking. So even if you're only hearing my voice today, to spare you from that being the only thing in this presentation or that I'm not presenting at you, we really hope to hear from you via the chat box. Everybody's already been really active, which I'm loving that. And we'll have as many notes from that'll serve as our notes, and we'll have as many notes from this call as we can to inform our work moving forward. So I'll be giving you ample time for you to respond to each of the poll questions. But before that, wanted to just really present to you a metaphor, right? And some of you are probably very familiar, too, with this metaphor even being shared in this same context, because this is an iceberg. And what lies beneath the surface of an iceberg is sometimes more than 2/3 what we actually see on the surface. And so that's a metaphor for trauma, and sometimes for the childhood trauma that we see and how it could be showing up in our classrooms, in our hallways, in our locker room, in this country, and frankly around the world. So these issues we care about are layered and complicated, and finding solutions to them oftentimes require us to look past what's just right in front of us and realize that there's often more than what may be clearly visible. So, historically, we've been addressing some of these issues in silos. You see those issues above the surface of the water around absenteeism and dropout and behavioral issues, say, such as fighting or being reclusive. So we've been addressing these issues in silos. But really, if we look at them and reframe them and think about them actually as important symptoms, then we can think about the conversation that needs to be had around helping to address and solve these problems as one where these might be symptoms above the surface of how trauma is actually showing up from underneath. And so you see there around adverse mental health, mental and physical effects as well. So this is not an exhaustive list. I'd be curious if there are more that you think need to be added here that you see how they're showing up, or even the language that we use and how we're describing these issues, these problems, these pain points that we need to be concerned about. I'd be very interested in, and this is going to be a key piece of the tool that I'm going to be sharing with you more on later to hear more from you. So this is part of the first meaning of changing minds. When we talk about shifting perspectives, trying to change minds and shift it from, he's a bad student to they're a hurt student, right? And how can we then provide more effective and compassionate supports? I think many of you might have heard also the way in which this is described in talking about childhood trauma, and a way to think differently about it is when we're able to, ask students, well, what happened to you, not what's wrong with you? And then going into the second meaning, so to speak, is really around the brain science and how we build resilience within the impact of physiological effects on witnessing and experiencing violence and abuse. And so with that, I'm actually going to share a video clip. It's a few minutes long, but it does a really great job of explaining and serving up the brain science, particularly in the context of a program that we're very familiar with. It's not the Changing Minds program, but a program that we're very familiar with here in California. And in particular, this clip highlights the work of Dr. Victor Carrion, who's a child psychiatrist at Stanford, who we also have worked closely with, and who was part of the advisory board in developing the Changing Minds campaign program. And so with that, I will start the video clip.
Back in this country, we turn to a classroom program designed to help young people cope with PTSD, a condition caused not by the shock of war, but by the stresses they encounter in life outside their schools. Jeffrey Brown has the story.
We start with our mountain pose, okay? And as you breathe out, lean to the right and feel that stretch along your left side.
At Cesar Chavez Academy in East Palo Alto, California, these 7th graders are part of an experiment to see if focused breathing can lead to focused learning.
And as you breathe out, come back to the middle.
Stanford University researchers John Redker and Michael Fu are using yoga and what's known as mindfulness practices to help students concentrate on classwork.
These practices are really designed to help us feel a little bit more awake, aware, and also relaxed.
We're going to get into our sort of relaxed state, and we're going to get into mindful practice. So first of all, for mountain pose, everybody go ahead and move your feet so that they're shoulder width apart. And let's take 3 breaths together. Let's inhale and exhale.
Cesar Chavez is in a low-income, high-crime neighborhood, and many of these students face real-world stresses, anxieties, and fears which can impair their ability to learn. Principal Amika Guillaume.
We have, by the 2010 census, as many as 50% students who are homeless. There's some very concrete things like a telephone, a mattress, a refrigerator with food in it, an address that you are in charge of. When I say children are under stress and duress, it's the little things. Let's not mention the shootings. Let's not even go into the gang war in our neighborhood. Just the little simple things are very stressful.
I want you to notice inward what you're feeling, so an emotion. And then I want to have somebody volunteer what their emotion is.
Relaxed.
Relaxed. Good.
So what scales were they used?
Dr. Victor Carrion, a professor at Stanford University's School of Medicine and head of the Early Life Stress Research Program, oversees the project at Cesar Chavez Academy.
We talk about adverse childhood experiences, we talk about trauma. Here we have the word suicide, drugs, sexual abuse, starving. This is what adverse childhood experiences are. This is the constant life of these children on a day-to-day basis. And not only they live it, but they have reminders on their own school.
We get all these emotions.
Carrion and his colleagues are trying to understand how children respond to daily stress, emotionally and even physiologically.
With functional imaging, we actually can see what the brain is doing.
He showed us brain images of children who suffer from chronic stress, revealing evidence of both cognitive impairment and post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD.
This link between stress and behavior actually shows up in the brain.
It does.
And so when there is stress or trauma in somebody's life, it shows up there?
Well, yes. What we can see is there is a deficit in the area of the middle frontal cortex in kids that have PTSD.
And in the developing brain of a child, Carrion says, PTSD can discourage learning.
So the issue that we have with stress and chronic stress, and when it manifests as a PTSD syndrome or disorder, is that some of the areas that are affected are areas that we need for our learning. For example, brain centers that process memory, brain centers that process executive function are particularly vulnerable. So PTSD can have an effect in how children learn.
According to Carrion, up to 30% of children who live in low-income, high-crime neighborhoods will show symptoms of PTSD.
Do I think that the stress of our community can get to a child? 110%, absolutely. For every child who acts out at our school, I can look exactly to the point in their life where things are not working. Every single time there is a very concrete, very sad story about why this child is not getting what he or she needs.
Bring arms up, and then...
Hi, thank you. So we're back, and I know that some of you were unable to hear the audio, and so there is a link to that video on YouTube that we can also share. And let's see, I can probably find that. I will put it in the chat box during the Q&A period. that we can go back, whoever was unable to hear can go back to it after the presentation. And just don't worry, there's only one other video as well, and that video too we can make available down the line. And so thanks so much. So as you can see in the video, Dr. Carrion really talks well about how the physiological effects can be really impacting how a young person is able to show up and be ready to learn and succeed in the classroom and beyond. And what we also see there, and frankly, you all know this so much better than me and know all too well, is how the school is a hub for so many important aspects of our lives. It is a hub it's a hub for so many different elements of the work that we do, and it really brings together so many different sectors in a strong and meaningful way. And so most clearly here is in thinking about trying to address these issues now that we've been talking about for almost 30 minutes, right, is how we can't do it alone. And so thinking about education as a sector coming in and school as a hub, well, what other sectors also come together in a space that can really promote healing on one level, but then also enable young people to thrive and really promote them to succeed? And that really brings in the health sector. So we think about our school nurses and social workers and pediatricians, and then also justice with school resource officers coming into play, particularly in schools as well, and peace officers. And then a fourth sector that we also identify as kind of quote-unquote community, thinking about after-school programs or extracurriculars and athletics. How do we bring in coaches and mentors into this work? It's really important to think about the various audiences that we've been brought in, because in how we reach out and focus in on addressing issues of childhood trauma are certainly around education and working with our AFT partners from that perspective, and then thinking about how can we also be one of a constellation of adults that are able to be caring and consistent in the lives of young people. And so because we know that one of the core protective factors on helping young people to thrive and succeed is the presence of a caring and consistent adult, we know that that being able to promote and foster multiple caring and consistent adults in the lives of kids is one of our primary goals and objectives of the campaign overall. And therefore, then, the initiative strives to reach a broad target or focus audience. And we just say, adults who interact with kids. And then when we get underneath that, you get into, all right, well, what's our strategy behind that? How do we focus in on professionals who interact with children and youth within these specific sectors, and recognizing school as an important hub to do that? How can this be integrated into many of the other efforts and initiatives that we might already be doing? And so some of the key takeaways from from the foundational work that we did in developing Changing Minds, where we talked with teachers, we talked with administrators, we talked with school counselors, teachers' aides, we talked with coaches. And many of us are doing the quote-unquote right things, right? How we are being caring and consistent and showing up for young people in various ways. And many of us are acting on instinct and our own experience, but we might be unaware of the science of trauma, which can really be motivating. And so that's just more, again, foundational and another support in how we can really expand the offerings, the training and materials and tools that are offered up when it comes to addressing childhood trauma. Bringing in the piece around brain science, we've found to be quite motivating in some respects. And so we certainly know that kids recognize the impact that adults have on them and are able to recall the people and actions that can really make a difference. And so with that, we synthesize Changing Minds down into what we're calling the 5 everyday gestures as our core call to action. These are certainly intended to be proactive, where we celebrate, we can comfort, listen, we can collaborate, and we inspire. young people to be their best selves and show up as best they can. But these two are not only meant to be one way, that we as those caring and consistent adults are only celebrating kids and comforting kids and listening to kids. But you know what? We know that students are also collaborating with us and inspiring us as well. And so this goes both, it can go both ways. It's really needed. This is particularly at a time like now where self-care is just so important. We need to take care of ourselves and each other in the context of these everyday gestures as well. And so in working with young people, but then also how are we taking care of each other and celebrating each other, comforting and listening to each other and collaborating with each other to be more effective in the work that we're looking to do. So across all of the gestures as well, there's one that's not explicitly identified, but know that it's a core theme that threads throughout, and it's really about helping, right? And so through celebrating and comforting and inspiring and collaborating, listening, we're also really helping, right? And what's really important to note here in thinking about these 5 everyday gestures is how these are for all kids. Yes, we're talking about specifically experiencing or witnessing violence and abuse and then the impact of trauma and those traumatic events on young people and their developing brain. But this is not intended to be a diagnostic tool. And I get, some of us that are familiar with ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and some say, oh yeah, well this has happened to me, or that's happened to Johnny, or this is what Susie's going through. These gestures are ones that we can serve up and we can activate for all kids so that all boats rise. And we know the ones who need it the most actually even go higher. So this is really about the importance of every day in this is, do we do this every day with every kid as much as we can? And with that, we created a series of videos, not yet released, so it's kind of hot off the presses, that I want to share with you the flagship intro video where it's going to kind of serve up the everyday gestures, in fact, explain and describe them even better than I can. And from this, we won't show every video that corresponds to each of the gestures, but just know this is the overview flagship video, as we call it, just a couple minutes long. This is also, if you're unable to hear it, we'll be able to provide this link to the video afterwards. But just know that there's also a video that corresponds with each of the gestures as we go on. So there's going to be a listen video, specifically a collaborate video, a comfort video, for example, but this is now just the overview. I'll play it. I'm going to play it right now.
King is a super special place. I love teaching here. We have a really diverse student body.
Hey, Isaac, welcome. We're sharing our name, a pronoun, and then we're talking about one thing that we're grateful for.
As a guardian teacher, I had this amazing opportunity to interface with our students and make them feel welcome.
Good morning, Ms. Robinson. On a general basis, every day is something different. Hey, Mario, hey, Sarah. You don't know where these kids are coming from. We have kids that's been homeless, maybe not eating when they come in the morning.
As a teacher, you see students for such a short window of time that you only see external manifestations of this turbulence that might be happening in their home lives. The amazing thing is, as an adult in these kids' lives, I can help reverse the damage done. The gestures are simple. Celebrate, inspire, collaborate, comfort, and listen.
These 5 healing gestures I actually use every day. It gives me more confidence in my ability to be a communicator and an educator. So when I was speaking, a lot of you were listening, and when you were speaking, we were listening to you, right?
I think without providing opportunities for healing, we risk having students who are unable to realize their full potential. I'm a believer that any child can never have too many caring adults in their life.
Great. Thank you for that. So without further ado, I will go on into the specific tool we want to hear more from you about, the infographic tool for the Changing Minds infographic tool for school staff that we created in partnership with Chelsea and her team. So I'm going to read through, there are 6 panels to the infographic. And it's important to note that there's already some printed copies available. And like I said, when we hear more from you about any improvements that can be made to it, we'll continue optimizing the material as we go on. And frankly, I'd love to hear also about any responses and feedback you have on the video series as well. I'm going to go through each of the panels, reading through it quickly, and then we'll get into some of the questions. I actually want to capture some of your feedback as well. So beyond just the poll question, we'll be asking for follow-up as we're going through and kind of assessing what some of the responses are. Please do provide any additional commentary that you may have in the actual group chat box. So the first panel and the introduction to the infographic. Now, you've already been primed, right? We've just been talking about this. Now for the action. Up to some of these issues. Understand how violence impacts child development and how to promote resilience. And so you see there are neglect, abuse, domestic violence, community violence. We want to really focus it in on the issues that we're talking about. Traumatic events can impact child's brains, bodies, and behaviors long after the events have occurred. More specifically, what this panel is intending to do is identify the type of traumatic event. This isn't about, say, natural disasters or death of a loved one, right? Which sometimes can be considered kind of more natural or more common causes of trauma for a child. This is more specific around some of these issues that have been laid out in this first panel. To manage the stress, children adopt coping mechanisms like aggression, lashing out, self-harm, withdrawing or escape, fighting. Thinking about the iceberg in that respect. Second panel. Science shows us that caring, supportive adults can help children heal from trauma. Adults in school settings are uniquely poised to support children and promote resiliency. By addressing trauma, we can increase readiness to learn, increase problem-solving ability, build safer, more supportive classrooms. Third panel, what can school staff do? Consider underlying causes of behavior. For example, when faced with defiance, instead of thinking, what is wrong with this child, ask yourself, what happened to this student and how can I help? 1, use everyday gestures to build relationships and promote healing. So there you'll see there are these icons, little symbols that represent each of the gestures with a little quote underneath each of them that kind of illustrates what it could sound like in practice. I don't need to go through each of the quotes, but I will read through the gestures again. You see there that little ribbon in the upper left quadrant is celebrate. Then to the right is an ear, listen. In the middle there we have a puzzle piece, collaborate. Lower left we have a heart, comfort. Lower right we have a light bulb, inspire. Number 2, minimize triggers. Sometimes, minimize triggers. Sometimes our actions and or the school environment itself that remind students of a traumatic event can bring on significant stress. reflect on triggers such as harsh lighting, slamming doors, shouting, bells and loudspeakers, unwelcome or unexpected touching. So just to be totally clear as well, that this is one piece that's intended to be kind of taken in its entirety. So the way in which it'll be printed out is going to be, say, two of these panels, these first two panels that introduced it side by side, and then it'll be like 2 panels by 3 panels. So it's one total piece. These are not intended to be separate tools. It's really intended to be one whole communication, if you will. We go into the third, number 3, although it's panel 5, right? So then you'll see it was the first 2 panels were the introduction around school staff can help students heal from trauma, and what kind of trauma are we talking about? We went into, all right, well, what are some of the various supports? And then the gestures and how to minimize triggers, and now a whole school approach. And I'll just read out these particular pieces as well. A whole school approach. Entire school communities can work together to support healthy child development. Trauma sensitivity may look different in every community, and we know it takes funding for certain efforts, but do consider what can be done to adopt trauma-informed practices and programs. Classroom brain breaks and planned physical activity to address the whole child. That kind of corresponds to the little ball icon we have in the upper left. And then a cloud, mindful breathing to promote effective stress management and relaxation. In the middle there, we have a clock, thoughtful scheduling of activities, including school start times and major assessments to help families stick to sleep routines. Certainly, that's going to be a really big one when we think about how the importance of maintaining a routine as a trauma-informed practice these days is so critical. Lower left corner says peace rooms and restorative justice circles to address rather than isolate challenging behaviors. I'd be particularly curious if in the chat box anybody has experience with some of those in their school. And then finally, breakfast after the bell programs to assure regular, well-balanced meals. Taking care of yourself is the last panel. Your own wellness is an essential resource for success. Trauma-informed educators can ensure that they are prepared to best support students by modeling resiliency. Stay calm in unpleasant situations, strengthen supporting relationships, ask for help, apologize for missteps even when no harm was intended, and accept mistakes as opportunities to learn. These are all taking care of ourselves, self-care tips for you all as educators. And I'd be remiss to not mention certainly that the Changing Minds initiative has been supported and launched, funded with support from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention at the Department of Justice. Now, we don't have much time, but we do have some questions I'd like to kind of breeze through, please, or the poll questions as I was talking about. So through this tool, did you learn new information about the impacts on trauma on children's blank development, health, behavior, academic performance, or something else? Please tell us in the group chat. Through this tool, did you learn new information about the impacts on children's development, health, behavior, academic performance, or something else? Okay, evenly divided out there between development and behavior, certainly. Okay. I think that the Victor Carrion, Dr. Carrion video was probably quite illuminating, includes a lot of great information. We'll go to the next one. After reviewing this tool, do you feel like you understand the 5 gestures and how they are used? Yes, I understand them and how they are used. I understand them, but not how they are used. There's the middle option there. And then no, I do not understand them or how they are used. Do you feel like after reviewing this tool, you understand the 5 everyday gestures and how they are used? Yes, I understand them and how they are used. I understand them, but not how they are used. No, I do not understand them and how they are used. Give a few more seconds here on this one. Around understanding of the 5 everyday gestures, please. All right. Yes, I understand how they are used. 86%. That's great. And certainly, we'll be looking at the chat box to see how we can improve more of that comprehension of how they can be used. Because it looks here still like roughly 15% of folks still have some questions on how they are used. And so at least hopefully this is interesting enough to even start the conversation. Again, this is a 101, so there's going to be more information and content underneath this infographic that can be shared. Going into another, do you feel like you understand why using these 5 everyday gestures would be helpful for children? Yes or no? Do you feel like you understand why these 5 everyday gestures would be helpful for children? Yes or no? I have give a few more seconds for this one. Do you feel like you understand why using these 5 everyday gestures would be helpful for children? Yes or no, please? Yeah, that's great. Not much discussion needed there. But again, any questions we have, please, let's use the chat box to our advantage. I'm coming up on time here. We have a few more of these poll questions remaining, so if you could please still bear with me. Thanks so much for your attention, and then we'll certainly get into some Q&A. Do you believe that actions like the 5 everyday gestures can help address the impacts of childhood trauma? Yes or no? Do you believe that the actions like the 5 everyday gestures can help address the impacts of childhood trauma? Yes or no? Great, 100%. That's fantastic. How likely are you to share this information with other educators or your administration? Very likely, likely, neutral, somewhat likely, or very unlikely? How likely are you to share this information with other educators or your administration? Very likely, likely, neutral, somewhat unlikely, or very likely? Okay, a few more here. How motivated are you to utilize these 5 everyday gestures with your students? Very motivated, motivated, neutral, somewhat unmotivated, or very motivated? Very unmotivated. Very motivated. And then I guess just 2 more questions, because now I'm curious too. It looks like many of you are motivated, And so then it's what might help increase our motivation to using these 5 everyday gestures. So many of you are already motivated, but I'm curious if you're already using the gestures in your everyday teaching practices, or if also support from the administration, additional information or training would help increase motivation. Anything else? Is it unlikely that you'll start using the 5 everyday gestures? And then the last question, how to use these gestures in my everyday teaching practice. Great. This is really helpful. Certainly support from administration, no surprise there. Additional information and training. And so, situations or conversations like this, being able to provide more visibility and spotlighting these issues, I think, is one of the core markers that we're actually really moving the needle on providing more opportunities for professional development and training within our districts around these issues. Okay, with there, I want to go to the Q&A. And I'll jump to my email since we won't have a lot of time to answer Q&A. I think I can stay on past this time as well with the chat box. I think it goes on past 3 p.m. Pacific, which is where I am right now. So I'm happy to stay on and answer questions that way. And of course, I'm going to share my email in just a second, and you can respond and get in touch with me that way. In fact, I really welcome keeping in touch with all of you if as the interest for this work expands, especially here, what might help increase our motivation to work, to use the everyday gestures and really build awareness around childhood trauma as additional information and training. So I'll stop there, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian. We are loving all this activity in the chat box. We've come right up close to the end of this hour here. Thanks, everybody, for chiming in with us. I've got Brian's email on the screen, and I just want to ask Brian one question, and then I'll do a few pieces of information for those who are still with us. We've got a lot of folks who are really interested in in-depth implementation. They really want to understand concepts beyond the 5 gestures. What is one place that you would recommend that they go, one place they would recommend they go to dive even deeper into understanding how to be trauma-informed in their day-to-day?
It's a great question. So, one, the Changing Minds, and I should have also put up the website. There is a website for this initiative, specifically called changingmindsnow.org. Changingmindsnow.org. And I mentioned a little earlier that the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network is really a clearinghouse of a lot of information, research on issues focused on addressing childhood trauma. The Changing Minds Now .org has a resource section that I want to highlight, as well as then the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network. And Chelsea, the AST certainly has resources as well.
Yes, and many of them are available on Share My Lesson. So you actually got way more than just one answer, folks, and I really hope that you find those helpful. I dropped some of those links into your chat box, which continues to be available to you after this webinar. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, so Brian, I want to say thank you. To all of our participants, I want to say thank you as well. And a few things I want you to know. The AFT and Share My Lesson really value your feedback. We do every year review how to make the virtual conference even stronger by looking at the ways that you really think that can happen. So we'll ask you to take the survey that will show up on your screen in a few moments when we end the live feed. This will be valuable to us as staff as well as to all of our presenters. We'd also love for you to visit the registration page for this session and add your own rating and review. So let people know what they can get into if they have the opportunity to access this on demand later on. The last thing that we want you to know is that Share My Lesson is completely understanding that this session, virtual conference, is certainly not all that is happening in the world, and the distance learning community really is here for you and tries to be a great clearinghouse for tips and free resources. We want to invite you to join us on Twitter, Instagram, feedback, Facebook rather, and right here on sharemylesson.com to make sure that you're getting all of the resources that we can find for you, curate for you, identify for you in real time. Thank you one more time for joining, and we hope that you have a great rest of your virtual conference. Bye.
Thank you.